Seattle didn't just rain. It wept. Elias Thorne gripped the steering wheel of his battered Kodiak delivery van, his knuckles sharp and white under the dashboard's sickly green glow. The windshield wipers beat a frantic, rhythmic thwack-thwack against the glass, smearing the neon reflections of towering holographic billboards rather than clearing the rain. From a mile up, an advertisement for synthetic serotonin beamed down through the smog, casting Elias's exhausted face in a pale, jittery light. He rubbed at his eyes with the heel of his hand, trying to grind away the gritty sensation of 22 hours without sleep. But Elias didn't have a choice. The comms unit bolted to the dash spat a burst of static, followed by a voice that was perfectly... Elias clenched his jaw, staring out through the smeared glass. Marcus Vance didn't care about trash haulers. As the regional night manager for Omni Logistics, Vance viewed his drivers not as people, but as malfunctioning cogs in a perfectly designed machine. He sat in a climate-controlled spire high above the damp rot of the lower city, sipping genuine coffee and monitoring blinking dots on a multi-paneled screen. The algorithm accounts for standard traffic deviations. Thorne. Vance's voice purred through the cheap speaker, laced with a velvet menace. Your route efficiency has dropped below 89%. Need I remind you that a dip below 85 triggers an automatic termination of your contract? And with your current financial encumbrances, I imagine unemployment would prove fatal. I'm making the turn onto Yesler now, Elias muttered, his voice hoarse from stale air and cheap caffeine. The comms clicked dead, leaving Elias alone with the hum of the Kodiak's failing electric motor and the relentless drumming of the rain. He was pushing 60 down a narrow industrial corridor when the shadows between the streetlights suddenly detached themselves. Shit! Elias slammed both feet onto the brake pedal and wrenched the steering wheel hard to the left. The chassis tilted violently, threatening to roll, before gravity slammed it back down onto its axles with a bone-jarring crunch. Elias sat frozen, his chest heaving, listening to the frantic thudding of his own heart. Nu Elias Briated. Pushing himself out of the driver's seat, he grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the console and scrambled through the narrow partition into the cavernous dark of the cargo bay. The air back here was stale, thick with the smell of ozone, damp cardboard, and the metallic tang of hot brakes. He flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of steel shelving. Most of the parcels were secured behind shock-cord webbing, but on the floor, near the rear doors, lay a premium black box package. Elias stepped closer, his boots splashing in a small puddle. He looked up. A rusted seam in the Kodiak's roof had finally given way, and acidic Seattle rain was steadily dripping down, precisely where the black box had been secured before the swerve knocked it loose. Damn it! Elias cursed, kneeling beside the fallen parcel. He aimed the flashlight at the shipping label. It was smeared and torn, the digital ink bleeding across the synthetic paper. Elias froze. Marcus Vance? His boss? Why would a package be routing through standard night freight to the regional manager? He reached out to lift the box, intending to secure it back on the shelf and pretend the drop hadn't happened. But the moment his fingers clamped around the edges, the waterlogged bottom gave way entirely. The contents spilled out onto the grated metal floor of the van with a heavy, metallic clatter. Elias, lying on the floor, was a cylinder about the size of a human forearm, constructed from a sleek, impossible metal that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. It looked like a prototype, something military or worse, black market quantum tech. But it wasn't the drive that made his breath catch in his throat. Beside the glowing cylinder lay a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. In an age where paper was a luxury reserved for the ultra-rich, the physical note was jarring enough. What was painted on it was worse. Elias leaned in, his nose catching the sudden, unmistakable copper stench of dried blood. Real blood, not synthetic dye. It was smeared across the paper in jagged, hurried strokes, forming a terrifyingly simple message. $10 million to the shadow wallet. Or she dies. We are watching the driver. The flashlight trembled in Elias's grip. The beam danced wildly across the bloody letters. We are watching the driver. His mind raced. A chaotic storm of panic and realization. This wasn't a standard delivery. This was a dead drop. If Vance was the recipient of a bloody ransom note, the man was involved in something far deeper and darker than managing delivery times. If Elias reported the damaged package, Vance would know he had seen the note. Vance would know Elias had seen the drive. In the corporate tiers of Seattle, couriers had been disappeared into the Puget Sound for far less. Think, Elias. Think. He whispered to the empty van, his voice trembling. He couldn't go back to the depot. He couldn't drop it off. He scrambled back to the cabin, lunging for his personal comlink, bypassing the company radio entirely. His fingers slipped on the glass screen, leaving a smear of sweat as he furiously punched in a scrambled frequency. Background noise immediately flooded the cabin. The screech of a hydrospanner, the heavy, thudding bass of underground synth-punk, and the crackle of a welding torch. Elias? A woman's voice cut through the noise, sharp and irritated. Do you have any idea what time it is? I'm elbows deep in the transmission of a stolen hover sedan. Chloe, Elias gasped, his voice tight. Chloe, I need your help, right now. At the sound of his tone, the welding torch in the background snapped off. The music lowered. Chloe Davis was the best black market mechanic in the Narrows. A girl who could rebuild a rotary. You sound like you're choking on glass. What happened? Did you wreck the rig? Worse, Elias said, staring through the partition at the pulsing blue light bleeding from the cargo bay. I dropped a package. A black box. The bottom fell out. Okay, so you dock a week's pay. Why are you calling me on the encrypted line? Chloe, it's a prototype drive. Something high level. And... He swallowed hard, tasting bile. And there's a note, written in blood. Real blood. Chloe. It's a ransom demand for 10 million credits. Silence stretched over the line, heavy and thick. When Chloe finally spoke, her voice had lost all its casual annoyance. It was cold, professional, and laced with absolute dread. Where are you right now? Soto District, near the old processing plant. Kill your GPS, Chloe ordered instantly. Rip the transponder out from under the dash. Elias looked at the company comms unit on the dash, the little green light blinking steadily, reporting his location to Vance's servers every 3 seconds. Chloe, the package was addressed to Vance. I don't care if it was addressed to the mayor of New Tokyo, Chloe snapped. Gut the tracker. I understand, Elias said, his hands already reaching under the steering column, his fingers curling around the thick bundle of wires leading to the Omni Logistics transponder. 10 minutes, Elias. If you're not here by then, I'm locking the blast doors. The line went dead. Elias took a deep breath, the stale air filling his lungs. He gripped the wire bundle, gave a savage yank, and tore the tracker from its housing. The green light flickered and died. A red warning flashed on the dash. Connection lost. He threw the van into drive, his hands gripping the wheel with renewed, desperate strength. The rain continued to batter the windshield, but Elias was no longer just a driver on the graveyard shift. As the Kodiak roared to life and tore out of the alley, Elias Thorne became a ghost, plunging head. The rain in the lower sectors didn't just fall. It assaulted the pavement. It came down in heavy, industrial sheets, catching the bleeding neon of the overhead signs and turning the asphalt into a shattered mirror of magenta and cyan. Inside the cab of his heavily modified delivery rig, Elias Thorne gripped the cracked leather of the steering wheel until his knuckles flushed white. The rhythmic, heavy thud of the windshield wipers did little to clear the glass, smearing the city's glare into a blinding kaleidoscope. Behind him, secured in the reinforced cargo hold, sat the package with the torn label. Elias kept his eyes darting between the slick road ahead and the rusted rectangular frame of his side mirrors. In the driver's side mirror, amidst the chaotic sea of glowing brake lights and luminous, Elias swallowed the dry taste of old coffee and ozone in his mouth. He blinked, adjusting his focus. Coincidence, he told himself. The city was full of corporate security details and high-end transport. But Elias hadn't survived 5 years running the Neon Tread, the city's illicit, off-the-books courier network, by belief. He flicked his turn signal and wrenched the heavy steering column hard to the right, taking the rig onto a narrow cross street lined with towering, dilapidated apartment blocks. The matte black SUV glided around the corner, maintaining exact pacing, exactly 4 car lengths back. "Damn it," Elias hissed, the sound lost beneath the guttural roar of the rig's diesel engine. He reached across the cramped cab, his calloused fingers fumbling with the latch of the glove box. It fell open, spilling a mess of toll receipts, loose fuses, and a cheap, plastic burner phone. He grabbed the phone, pressing the single pre-programmed speed dial with his thumb. He wedged the device between his shoulder and his ear, his hands returning to the wheel. The phone rang twice. A burst of digital static crackled over the tiny speaker, followed by a sharp, feminine voice. "Tell me you didn't look at the torn label," Chloe Davis said. "No greeting, no preamble. Just the razor-wire pragmatism Elias relied on." "I didn't have to look, Chloe. The label was ripped. The contents are practically humming," Elias said, his eyes flicking to the rear view. "And I've picked up a shadow. Matte black SUV. Professional spacing." A heavy sigh crackled through the earpiece. The sound of rapid, furious typing echoed in the background. Chloe was plugged into the city's grid, a ghost in the machine operating out of a server farm in the flooded sublevels of Sector 4. "Give me your coordinates." "Heading north on Kestrel, crossing 84th, Elias said, downshifting as the traffic ahead clumped together. The rig's engine growled in protest. "Hold on," Chloe murmured. The typing intensified, a staccato rhythm of keys. "Okay, I'm tapping the traffic cams on Kestrel. I see you. Heavy rig, faded blue chassis. Do you see the tail?" Elias, merging aggressively from a parallel lane, cutting off a blaring taxi, was a second matte black SUV. "They're running a pincer protocol," Chloe said, her voice tight. "No license plates." Elias didn't need a second. He knew the tactics, the slow box-in, the isolation. They wouldn't shoot him in the middle of Kestrel Avenue. They would herd him into an industrial dead zone, disable the rig with an EMP spike or a localized tire blowout, and extract the package. And him? He would become another permanent fixture at the bottom of the city's poisoned harbor. "Marcus Vance," Chloe breathed, the name carrying a weight that chilled the humid air inside the cab. Elias's grip tightened until the leather of the wheel groaned. Marcus Vance wasn't a standard security thug. He was a corporate fixer for the uppermost echelons of the Apex conglomerate. Vance didn't just solve problems. He excised them from reality. He was known for his bespoke suits, his icy demeanor, and a body count that read like a localized plague. If Vance was here personally, the package in the back of the rig was worth more than Elias's life 1,000 times over. "I need an out, Chloe. Now." "You can't outrun them on the avenues," she said rapidly. "Those SUVs have twin-turbo V8s and reinforced rams. They'll flip your rig if you let them get parallel. You need to take them where they can't fit." "The Warrens," Elias said, his eyes scanning the looming architecture ahead. The Warrens was a labyrinthine district of old-world alleyways, structurally condemned meatpacking plants, and illegal shanty markets. It was a chaotic, claustrophobic nightmare for standard vehicles. For Elias, it was his backyard. "Taking the next right," Elias yelled. "Stay on the line." He didn't bother with the signal this time. The massive truck drifted violently, its rear bumper clipping a municipal trash can and sending it spinning into the gutter in a shower of sparks and garbage. Behind him, the twin SUVs reacted with terrifying precision. They didn't skid. They didn't drift. They executed perfect, synchronous turns, their suspensions absorbing the shock as they plunged into the alley after him. The environment instantly changed. The blinding neon of the main avenue vanished, replaced by the flickering, sickly yellow of dying sodium lamps. The alley was suffocatingly tight. Brick walls scraped on either side, separated by less than 15 feet. Overhead, a chaotic web of illegal power lines and rusted fire escapes blocked out the sky, turning the rain into heavy, sporadic drops that hammered the roof of the cab like gunfire. Elias checked his mirrors. The SUVs were closing the gap. They didn't care about the tight fit. Their drivers were willing to sacrifice the paint jobs. Sparks showered the alley as the lead SUV scraped against a brick outcropping, its headlights blazing through Elias's rear window, blinding him. "They're still on me," Elias shouted over the deafening roar of the diesel engine echoing off the brick walls. "Take the left fork at the old slaughterhouse," Chloe ordered. "It's a blind turn, 50 degrees. I'm hacking the automated bollards at the end of the adjacent street. If you can make it through, I'll raise them and shear their pursuit." "Got it." Elias pushed the accelerator to the floorboards. The rig vaulted over a pronounced dip in the asphalt, the suspension bottoming out with a teeth-rattling crunch. Ahead, the alley split. To the right, a wider path leading back toward the commercial district. To the left, a jagged, impossibly tight corridor that he didn't slow down. He couldn't. If he dropped, the passenger side of the truck slammed into the brick corner of the slaughterhouse, the impact tearing a long, agonizing shriek of rending metal through the night. The cab shuddered violently. Elias was thrown against the door, his seatbelt locking hard across his collarbone. Sparks rained down like a localized firework display as the rig's armored siding chewed through the masonry. He wrestled control back, his boots dancing over the pedals, stabilizing the fishtailing back end. The lead SUV, driven with terrifying aggression, attempted to mirror the maneuver. But physics favored the native. The SUV came in too hot. It clipped the brick corner Elias had just shattered, but lacking the rig's massive momentum and angled armor, the impact spun the black vehicle. It slammed sideways into the opposite wall, the crunch of shattering glass and crumpling steel echoing down the corridor. One down, but his triumph was ephemeral. Through the smoke and steam rising from the wrecked lead vehicle and sitting in the passenger seat, illuminated by the dash lights, was a silhouette Elias recognized from the city's darkest rumors. Even through the rain and the chaos, he could feel Marcus Vance's gaze. It was a cold, calculating weight pressing against the back of his neck. "Elias, the bollards are 300 yards ahead." Chloe's voice cracked over the phone, barely audible over the screaming engine. "You have to clear the intersection." Elias looked ahead. The narrow alley spilled out onto a slightly wider transverse street. Just beyond the intersection, he could see the heavy steel. The second SUV was surging forward, the driver utilizing a straightaway to close the distance. They were mere feet from his rear bumper. The engine of the black vehicle roared, preparing for the pit maneuver. "Come on! Come on!" Elias chanted, his foot mashing the pedal. The RPM gauge buried itself in the red. The engine whined, begging for mercy. He burst out of the alleyway, crossing the transverse street in a blur of motion. The rig rattled violently as it crossed the metal threshold of the bollard housing. "Now, Chloe! Now!" Behind him, the SUV surged out of the alley, closing the final gap. With a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a dragon exhaling, for massive cylinders of reinforced steel shot upward from the pavement. The driver of the front end crumpled like tin foil, the engine block shattering. He kept his foot on the gas, tearing down the dark street, letting the labyrinth of the Warrens swallow him whole. He drove for another 10 blocks before he finally allowed himself to lift his foot off the accelerator. His breath came in ragged, burning gasps. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely hold the steering wheel. The silence in the cab, save for the idle rumble of the engine and the relentless drumming of the rain, was deafening. He pulled the burner phone to his ear. "Chloe, I'm here," she said, her voice softer now, laced with residual tension. "Cameras show the second vehicle is totaled. No movement yet. You're clear, Elias. For now." Elias looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, a dark tunnel of rain and shadows. But he knew the truth. Marcus Vance wasn't dead. He was just delayed. "They know my rig," Elias said, his voice raspy. "They know my face. The tread is compromised." "Get to the secondary safe house in the rail yards," Chloe instructed. "Ditch the rig 2 blocks away. We need to open that package, Elias. We need to know exactly why Marcus Vance is willing to tear the city apart to find you." Elias disconnected the call. He tossed the burner phone onto the passenger seat and shifted into gear. The neon lights of the city bled through the rain-streaked windshield, no longer a beacon of home, but the glowing eyes of a cage. The hunt had begun, and the only way out was forward, deeper into the dark. The rain in the Narrows didn't fall. It existed as a permanent, oppressive mist that tasted of copper and exhaust. Elias Thorne pulled the collar of his leather jacket up against the chill, his boots crunching over shards of broken synth glass that littered the alleyway. In his right hand, the burner phone glowed with a sickly, fractured luminescence, displaying a string of GPS coordinates that had been buried in the encrypted metadata of the ransom note. In his left hand, he gripped the reinforced strap of the canvas duffel bag. It was heavy, heavier than it had any right to be. According to the coordinates, his payday was waiting at the end of this rotting industrial corridor. 3 million unmarked credits in exchange for the prototype he'd blindly scooped up after the botch drop. The torn label on the cylinder still haunted his peripheral vision, but Elias had spent a lifetime ignoring red flags if the green paper was stacked high enough. The burner's screen pulsed, the blue dot converging with a red pin. 47 degrees 36 minutes 14.2 seconds north, 122 degrees 19 minutes 59.8 seconds west. Elias looked up. Before him loomed the skeletal remains of a decommissioned desalination plant. The massive steel doors had been welded shut, but a side access hatch hung slightly ajar, bleeding a sliver of harsh white light into the gloom. He didn't trust the light. He didn't trust the open door. Most of all, after the fleet of black SUVs that had nearly run him off the viaduct 3 hours ago, he didn't trust the silence. Elias unholstered the compact mag pistol at his hip, the weapon a comforting, familiar weight. He approached the hatch, sliding his back against the damp concrete. He nudged the heavy iron door with the toe of his boot. It groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a narrow descent into the bowels of the facility. He moved with practiced silence, descending the grated iron stairs. The air down here was different, thick with the smell of ozone, scorched wiring, and stale coffee. It was the undeniable scent of paranoia. At the bottom of the stairwell, a narrow corridor opened into what used to be a subterranean control room. Elias paused, his eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the dimness. A thin, almost imperceptible red laser cut across his shin, inches from the hem of his jeans. A tripwire. He followed the beam to the wall, where a block of high-yield plastic explosive was wired to a crude detonator. "Messy," Elias muttered under his breath. He carefully stepped over the beam, his heart rate steadying into the familiar, cold rhythm of a job. He navigated 2 more tripwires and a pressure plate before reaching the main chamber. The room was a chaotic nest of jury-rigged technology. Banked server racks hummed with desperate intensity, cables snaking across the flooded concrete floor like a nest of black vipers. In the center of the room, illuminated by the harsh glare of a dozen mismatched monitor screens, sat a figure huddled over a workbench. "I wouldn't take another step," Courier? A voice echoed, sharp and trembling. Elias froze. The figure at the workbench spun around, revealing a woman who looked as though she had been assembled from frayed nerves and caffeine. Her dark hair was hacked short and uneven, her pale skin illuminated by the blue light of the monitors. She wore a high-end corporate lab coat, but it was stained with grease, dirt, and what looked alarmingly like dried blood. She gripped a heavy, corporate-issue kinetic revolver in both hands. "Chloe Davis, I presume," Elias said, keeping his voice low and even. "You're a hard woman to find. Your coordinates almost led me into the bay." "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Where is Silas? He was supposed to make the run." Silas caught a bad case of high-velocity lead poisoning about 6 blocks from the drop point, Elias said, watching her face pale even further. "I'm the guy who picked up his fumble. I have the package. You have the money. We do this quick, and we both get to pretend today never happened." Chloe lowered the gun a fraction of an inch, a harsh, broken laugh scraping its way out of her throat. It was the sound of a woman teetering on the absolute edge of sanity. "Money? You think this is about a payout?" Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The golden rule of the underground. When the client laughs, the courier bleeds. "The ransom note," Elias said, his grip tightening on the duffel bag. Chloe stepped fully into the light, lowering the revolver completely. She looked at the duffel bag as if it contained a live rattlesnake. "There is no money, you idiot. The ransom note was a ruse. A flare I shot up into the dark web to get anyone, to pull that canister out of the corporate sector before Marcus Vance got his hands on it." "No money?" Elias repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. His dream of a one-way ticket to the orbital colonies, of leaving the rain and the neon and the blood behind, evaporated in an instant. He let out a long, slow exhale. "Do you have any idea what I went through to get this here? I had 3 black SUVs chasing me through the industrial district. Men in tactical armor." "Marcus Vance," Chloe whispered, her eyes darting toward the reinforced ceiling as if she could see the corporate executioner hovering above them. "He's Vanguard Dynamics head of internal acquisitions. But acquisitions is just a polite word for scrubbing evidence. If Vance is on you, he doesn't want the prototype back. He wants it buried, along with anyone who has ever looked at it." "It's a synthetic organ prototype," Elias argued, though the sinking feeling in his chest told him otherwise. "Vanguard's next-gen biotech. That's what Silas told me." "Silas didn't know a damn thing," Chloe snapped, moving toward him. She reached for the duffel bag, her fingers trembling. "Open it." Elias hesitated, then unzipped the heavy canvas. He reached inside and pulled out the smooth, matte black cylinder. The torn warning label on its side still bore the Vanguard corporate logo, but the text beneath it was obscured. Chloe tapped a sequence into a datapad on her wrist. The cylinder hissed, its biometric seals disengaging with a puff of freezing, sterile vapor. The top slid back, revealing not a mechanical heart or a synthetic liver, but a small, glowing vial of viscous, crimson fluid suspended in a magnetic field. "What is that?" Elias asked, the hairs on his arms standing on end. "Project Chimera," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "I was the lead bioengineer. We were told we were developing a targeted gene therapy meant to eradicate hereditary diseases. We thought we were curing cancer, Elias. But 6 weeks ago, I found the shadow ledgers in the mainframe." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the crimson glow of the vial. "It's not a cure. It's a weaponized. It doesn't fix DNA. It unravels it. And it's programmable. You map a specific genetic marker into this fluid, release it into a localized water supply, and it will hunt down a specific bloodline. It can wipe out an entire family tree, an entire ethnicity, an entire demographic in a matter of days, and it leaves no trace. Just mass cardiac failure. Elias stared at the vial, the ambient noise of the humming servers suddenly fading away. He wasn't holding a ticket to a better life. He was holding a phantom nuke. Vanguard is planning to sell it to the highest bidder on the black market, Chloe continued, tears finally spilling over her lashes, cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. I tried to blow the whistle. I downloaded the schematics, stole the only viable prototype, and ran. But Vance is a hound. Once he catches your scent, he doesn't stop. So you drag me into this? Elias said, anger finally piercing through his shock. You put a target on my back with a fake bounty. I needed a courier who could survive the Narrows. She fired back, defiant. I needed someone who could get the Chimera strain to the independent journalists in Sector 4. I couldn't do it myself. Vance already knows my biometric signature. He has eyes on every transit hub in the city. Elias looked at the open hatch, then down at the glowing red fluid. He was a mercenary, a runner. He didn't do politics, and he certainly didn't do suicide missions against the largest biocorp on the eastern seaboard. He reached for the cylinder's lid to seal it back up. I'm out, Elias said flatly. I'll leave the package here. You find another martyr. Before Chloe could argue, a sharp, piercing alarm shattered the silence of the subterranean lair. The overhead lights flickered and died, instantly replaced by spinning, blood-red emergency strobes. The shadows in the room began to dance violently. Chloe rushed to the primary monitor, her hands flying across the mechanical keyboard. Proximity sensors, she gasped. The upper perimeter just got breached. How many? Elias asked, his pistol already raised, his thumb flicking the safety off. 3? No, 5 heat signatures, Chloe said, panic rising in her throat. Moving fast. Vance? Elias said, a cold certainty settling over him. He must have tracked the GPS ping from the burner phone when you accessed the coordinates, she said, backing away from the console. She grabbed her revolver, her hands shaking worse than before. We're trapped. Elias looked at the terrified bioengineer, then down at the glowing red vial that held the power to commit invisible genocide. He thought of the black SUVs. He thought of Silas bleeding out in the gutter. There was no walking away now. Vance didn't leave witnesses. If Elias left the room without the prototype, he was dead. If he stayed, he was dead. The only way out was through. Elias slammed the lid of the cylinder shut, waiting for the hiss of the pressurized seal, and shoved it back into the duffel bag. He slung the heavy canvas over his shoulder and racked the slide of his mag pistol. The metallic clack was loud enough to cut through the wailing alarm. Is there another way out of this tomb? Elias demanded, grabbing Chloe by the sleeve of her lab coat and pulling her toward the back of the server racks. There's an old drainage pipe that empties into the storm channels, she stammered, pointing a trembling finger toward a rusted grate in the far wall. But it's a labyrinth down there. Better a labyrinth than a firing squad, Elias said. Above them, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed down the grating squealed as the Vanguard hit squad descended. Through the strobe-lit darkness, Elias caught the distinct, metallic sound of an assault rifle being cocked. Elias Thorne had come looking for a payday. Instead, he had inherited a war. Move, Elias growled, pushing Chloe toward the grate. And whatever you do, don't drop the bag. The rain in Sector 4 didn't fall. It spat. It was a relentless, acidic drizzle that slicked the cracked asphalt and turned the city's neon reflections into bleeding, bruised watercolors. Inside the whistleblower's lair, a decommissioned subterranean transit hub retrofitted with stolen server racks and reinforced steel plating. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, stale synth-CAF, and exhausting paranoia. The low, rhythmic thrum of cooling fans provided a white noise blanket over the oppressive silence. Elias Thorne sat on a sagging full-leather crate, the harsh, pale blue light of a cracked datapad illuminating the hollows of his cheeks. Across the room, Chloe Davis lay curled on a makeshift cot of sleeping bags, her chest rising and falling in the shallow, erratic rhythm of someone who expected to be hunted even in her dreams. Her fingers twitched, instinctively reaching for a sidearm that rested just beneath her pillow. She had sacrificed everything, her career, her reputation, very nearly her life, to drag the prototype out of the corporate abyss. Elias looked away from her, the guilt twisting like a serrated blade in his gut. He looked back down at the datapad. Final notice. The words pulsed in a violent, unforgiving crimson at the top of the screen. Below it, a cascade of itemized medical charges unspooled like a death sentence. Asterisk neural lattice stabilization. Synthetic spinal fluid infusions. Cryostasis ward fees. Asterisk. His sister, Mia, was deteriorating. Her synaptic degradation was accelerating, a vicious disease that the public health sector had written off as untreatable. But the private sector, the gleaming ivory towers above the smog line, possessed the cure. It was only a matter of credits. Millions of them. Credits Elias didn't have. Unless Elias reached into the deep pocket of his tactical jacket, his fingers brushing against the cold, geometric contours of the prototype. The device was no larger than a cigarette case, a seamless block of hyperdense quantum circuitry that held the capacity to rewrite the city's data infrastructure. To Chloe, it was the ultimate weapon of truth, the key to exposing a monopoly built on blood. To the men in the black SUVs who had hunted them through the alleys in Chapter 2, it was stolen property worth a small war. But to Elias, it was a lifeline. It was Mia's breath, Mia's future. He swallowed hard, the metallic tang of fear dry in his mouth. Slowly, silently, he stood up, his boots making no sound on the grated iron floor. He moved past the humming servers, slipping out of the main chamber and into the cavernous, dripping expanse of the abandoned maintenance tunnel. The air here was colder, smelling of rust and dead centuries. He pulled a heavy, encrypted burner comms unit from his belt. It was a bulky, archaic piece of tech, immune to the modern surveillance nets that cast a web over the city. He punched in a frequency he had bought off a shivering data broker 3 weeks ago, back before the torn label, before he and Chloe were public enemies. The line hissed with static, popping like grease on a hot griddle. Then, a voice cut through the white noise. It was a voice that belonged in a high-rise boardroom, smooth and impeccably calibrated. "The hour is late for wrong numbers," Marcus Vance said. The representative of the Vanguard Syndicate sounded mildly amused, though the underlying threat was unmistakable. "It's not a wrong number," Elias said, keeping his voice to a low, gravelly whisper. "I have the drive, the architect's prototype." There was a pause. The static seemed to hold its breath. When Vance spoke again, the amusement was gone, replaced by the calculating chill of an apex predator scenting blood. "Many people claim to have many things, Mr. Thorne. I assume it is Thorne, given the localized encryption bounce. You've been making quite a bit of noise lately. You and the idealistic Miss Davis." Elias tightened his grip on the burner. "I don't care about the noise. I care about the auction. I'm bypassing the black market. I want a direct sale tonight. 10 million, untraceable bearer bonds, transferred into an offshore medical trust." 10 million, Vance mused, the words rolling off his tongue like fine wine. A steep price for a piece of stolen hardware. It's the skeleton key to your rival's entire network, Vance. Don't play coy. It's worth $1 billion and you know it. 10 million is a fire sale. Elias pressed his forehead against the cold, damp concrete of the tunnel wall. "But it has to be tonight." "Desperation is a poor negotiating tactic, Thorne," Vance replied, though Elias could hear the greed snapping into place like a bear trap. "But I admire your initiative. The crossroads. 1 hour. Come alone." The line went dead. Elias stood in the dark for a long moment, the silence of the tunnel rushing back in to fill the void. He had done it. He had crossed the invisible line. He slipped the burner back into his belt and walked back toward the faint, warm glow of the safe house. As he stepped through the heavy steel bulkhead, Chloe was sitting up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises in the monitor light. "Elias?" she mumbled, her hand dropping away from her weapon. "Where were you?" "Just checking the perimeter nodes," Elias lied, the words tasting like ash. He forced a reassuring smile, moving toward the supply crate to gather his gear. "The encryption is holding, but the latency is spiking. I need to go topside, boost the signal from a cleaner vantage point, and maybe scrounge up some decent rations." Chloe frowned, her sharp intellect cutting through the haze of exhaustion. She stood up, pulling her jacket tightly around her shoulders. "It's too dangerous out there right now. Their sweepers will be running thermal scans of the district." "I know the blind spots," Elias said, strapping his holster to his thigh. He avoided her gaze, focusing entirely on the mechanical click of the buckle. "I won't be long. Keep the vault sealed until I knock." Chloe stepped closer. For a terrifying second, Elias thought she could hear his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, guilty drumbeat. She reached out and rested a hand on his arm. "We're close, Elias. Once I decrypt the final layer of this drive, we upload it to the global feeds. We expose them all. The nightmare ends tomorrow." "Yeah," Elias whispered, staring at her hand. "Tomorrow." He turned and walked away before she could see the profound sorrow fracturing his stoic expression. He cycled the heavy vault door, stepping out into the neon-drenched belly of the city. The journey to the crossroads was a blur of rain and shadow. The district was an industrial graveyard, a labyrinth of decaying hyperrail tracks and rusted scaffolding that loomed against the smog-choked night sky. Sickly yellow light spilled from broken street lamps, casting long, skeletal shadows across the flooded streets. The crossroads was an intersection of 3 abandoned rail bridges, suspended high above a churning spillway. The wind howled through the steel cables, carrying the bitter scent of industrial runoff. Elias arrived at the center of the intersection, his coat heavy with rain. He didn't have to wait long. The hum of a high-end repulsor engine vibrated through the metal grating beneath his boots. A sleek, obsidian hover limo descended from the fog, flanked by 2 armored escort drones that tracked Elias with glowing red optics. The limo settled onto the bridge with a hydraulic hiss, its gull-wing door sweeping upward. Marcus Vance stepped out. He was immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to repel the rain. A silver cybernetic implant traced the line of his jaw, glowing faintly in the gloom. He was flanked by 2 massive enforcers, their trench coats failing to hide the heavy assault rifles slung across their chests. "Thorn," Vance greeted, stepping into the yellow halo of a flickering arc lamp. He held a slim, brushed steel briefcase in his left hand. "You look exactly as tired as a man in your position should." "Cut the poetry, Vance," Elias said, his hand resting casually near his holstered weapon, though he knew he'd be cut to ribbons before he cleared leather. "Do you have the bonds?" Vance smiled. It was a thin, bloodless expression. He tossed the briefcase onto the wet metal grating between them. It popped open, displaying stacks of shimmering, cryptographically sealed data wafers. 10 million, as requested. The medical trust routing numbers are preloaded. Elias stared at the case. It was right there. Mia's life, packaged in brushed steel and blinking lights. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the prototype. The small block of quantum circuitry caught the ambient light, refracting it into a prism of colors. Vance's eyes locked onto the device, the greed finally cracking his polished veneer. He took a half-step forward. "Bring it here," Vance commanded softly. Elias took a step toward the case but stopped. The hairs on the back of his neck suddenly stood up. The tactical instincts that had kept him alive this long were screaming. He looked past Vance, noticing the subtle shift in the enforcer's stances. Their hands were tightening on their weapons. "You aren't just here to buy the drive," Elias realized aloud, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Vance chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "I am a businessman, Elias. I don't just buy assets. I eliminate liabilities. Miss Davis is a liability. Her idealistic crusade threatens the very ecosystem my syndicate relies upon. If I leave her alive, she'll just find another whistle to blow." "That wasn't the deal," Elias snarled, stepping back, gripping the prototype tightly. "The deal," Vance said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill, "was that I would pay you 10 million credits, and I am. But in exchange, you are going to give me the drive, and then you are going to lead my men back to your little underground vault." "No," Elias said, his heart pounding in his throat. "Think of your sister, Elias," Vance purred, gesturing to the glowing briefcase. "The money is right there. All you have to do is trade one life for another. Miss Davis for Mia. A simple equation." The trap had snapped shut. Elias stood at the crossroads, the rain battering his face, the weight of the prototype heavy in his hand, and the crushing realization that his betrayal had not bought his sister's salvation. It had only purchased his own damnation. Vance raised a hand, and the red lasers of the escort drones painted Elias's chest. "Make your choice, Mr. Thorne," Vance said into the howling wind. "We don't have all night." The rain fell on Puget Sound not in drops, but in cold, vindictive sheets. It drummed a chaotic, deafening rhythm against the corrugated steel of Pier 48's abandoned shipping containers, a rusted labyrinth perched on the edge of the black water. Through the thick, maritime fog, the towering gantry cranes loomed like skeletal giants, their steel bones weeping rust into the puddles below. Half a mile down the waterfront, the massive neon signs of a gentrified dockside district, a sprawling, pulsing mosaic of electric magenta, cyan, and sickly emerald, bled through the mist. The colored light caught the slick, uneven asphalt of the shipyard, turning the ground into a shattered, glowing mirror. Elias Thorne pressed his back against the freezing metal of a red Maersk container, his breath pluming in the chill air. His hands, slick with rain and trembling slightly from the adrenaline cocktail flooding his veins, gripped the cold polymer of his 9mm Glock. At his feet sat the black canvas duffel bag. It was heavy, $3 million heavy. The payout for selling his soul, or what was left of it, at the crossroads of his own greed. Beside him, Chloe Davis knelt in the shadows, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her blonde hair was plastered to her skull, her raincoat soaked through, but her eyes wide, terrified, yet burning with a stubborn, flickering defiance, never left Elias. Her knuckles were white as she clutched the waterproof casing that held the encrypted hard drive, the whistleblower's holy grail, the digital ledger that proved Marcus Vance and his corporate syndicate had been trafficking weapons through the very shipping lanes they were currently hiding in. "How long?" Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible over the relentless drumming of the rain. "The boat is supposed to be here at midnight," Elias murmured, checking the glowing face of his dive watch. 10 minutes. We just have to stay out of sight for 10 minutes. But even as the words left his mouth, the sweeping arc of high-beam headlights sliced through the fog. Elias's stomach plummeted. He peeked around the rusted corner of the container. 3 matte black SUVs slithered onto the wet tarmac of the shipyard, their engines a low, predatory purr that vibrated in Elias's molars. The vehicles fanned out in a tactical crescent, cutting off the main exit. Doors opened with heavy, synchronized thuds. Out stepped Marcus Vance. Even in the heart of an industrial wasteland, Vance looked as though he had just stepped out of a boardroom. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, standing perfectly still while a hulking subordinate held an umbrella over his head. In the neon-streaked darkness, Vance's face was an unreadable mask of cold authority. Behind him, a dozen men spilled from the SUVs, moving with the terrifying, silent efficiency of professional wetwork operatives. Suppressed submachine guns gleamed under the sweeping beams of their tactical flashlights. "Elias," Vance's voice crackled through a portable megaphone, echoing eerily off the metal canyons of the shipyard. "I know you're in there. You're a pragmatic man, a mercenary. You have the bag. I let you keep it. Just leave the girl and the drive and you walk away." A wealthy, breathing man. Elias looked down at the duffel bag. The nylon was soaked, but the wealth inside was insulated. It was everything he had ever chased. The penthouse in Miami, the quiet exit, the end of the hustle. All he had to do was step away. He looked at Chloe. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She just stared at him, resigning herself to the brutal calculus of the underworld she had stumbled into. She expected him to betray her. Everyone else had. A heavy, suffocating silence hung between them, pregnant with the weight of Elias's impending choice. He reached down. His fingers brushed the heavy nylon straps of the duffel bag. Then, the screech of locking brakes shattered the night. From the opposite end of the pier, a convoy of unmarked, reinforced gray vans smashed through the chain-link perimeter fence, sending sparks flying into the rain. They skidded to a halt on the slick pavement, flanking Vance's position. Elias's eyes widened. The rival syndicate, the Eastern European cartel that Vance had double-crossed in the weapons deal, the very people who had been hunting the hard drive to blackmail Vance's empire. Elias had tipped them off anonymously through a burner phone 2 days ago as a contingency, a desperate smokescreen. He just hadn't expected them to arrive at the exact same time. Men poured out of the vans, heavily armored, wielding unsuppressed Kalashnikovs. The neon light from the distant city caught the harsh angles of their ballistic masks. "Vance?" A voice roared from the cartel's side, thick with a Russian accent. "The drive is ours." For a split second, the Seattle shipyard became the most dangerous piece of real estate on Earth. A Mexican standoff painted in rain and neon. Then, a nervous finger slipped. A single shot cracked like thunder. The shipyard erupted. It was a sudden, apocalyptic symphony of violence. Muzzle flashes strobed through the fog like the frantic pulse of a dying nightclub, illuminating the rain in brilliant, violent snapshots of white, yellow, and orange. The deafening roar of automatic weapons fire echoed off the steel containers, multiplying the sound until it was a physical pressure against the eardrums. Bullets chewed through the corrugated steel of the container Elias and Chloe were hiding behind. The metal shrieked and tore. "Down!" Elias roared, grabbing Chloe by the collar of her jacket and slamming her onto the wet asphalt just as a spray of high-caliber rounds punched through the metal where her head had been a second before. Sparks showered over them like venomous fireflies. "We have to move," Elias shouted over the cacophony. "They're going to flank this position." He grabbed the duffel bag with his left hand, his Glock in his right, and hauled Chloe to her feet. They bolted down the narrow alley between 2 towering stacks of shipping containers. Behind them, the battle raged. Vance's men moved with clinical precision, utilizing cover and suppressed bursts, while the rival cartel fought with overwhelming, brutal firepower. Elias and Chloe sprinted through the puddles, their boots splashing violently in the magenta-lit water. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the gap ahead. One of Vance's hitmen, tactical laser cutting a straight green line through the mist, aimed directly at Chloe's chest. Elias didn't think. He dropped the duffel bag. It hit the ground with a heavy splash. Elias brought his Glock up with both hands, stepping squarely in front of Chloe to shield her. He squeezed the trigger twice. The heavy recoil pushed into his palms. The hitman staggered, his armor absorbing the first shot, but the second caught him in the unprotected throat. The man collapsed into the neon-soaked water, his blood spiraling out like black ink. More shouts echoed down the corridor of steel. Footsteps approached rapidly from behind. Elias reached down to grab the bag, but a stray burst of assault rifle fire tore down the alley. The bullets skipped off the pavement and ripped directly into the canvas duffel. The bag exploded. Banded stacks of $100 bills burst into the air, shredded by the crossfire. The wind and the rain caught the currency, scattering the green paper like dead leaves in a hurricane. They fluttered down into the bloody, neon-lit puddles, instantly soaked and ruined. Elias froze for a fraction of a second, watching his fortune, his escape, his greed literally blown to pieces. "Elias!" Chloe screamed, tugging at his arm. He looked from the floating, worthless paper to Chloe's terrified face. In that instant, the crushing weight he had carried for years, the endless, exhausting hunger for the next score, evaporated. The money was gone, and as the realization washed over him, Elias felt an entirely new sensation: liberation. The true cost of his greed hadn't just been his morality. It had been his freedom. Now, stripped of the payout, all that remained was the raw, undeniable imperative to keep this woman alive. To do one right thing in a life built on wrong choices. "Leave it," Elias said, his voice surprisingly calm amidst the roaring gunfight. He gripped her hand tightly. "It's gone. Let's go." They navigated the maze of steel, the sounds of slaughter echoing around them. The smell of ozone, spent cordite, and copper blood hung thick in the damp air. They reached the edge of the pier. The black, churning water of Puget Sound lay below them, crashing against the wooden pylons. Through the fog, a low, thrumming sound grew louder. A small, unlit Zodiac boat was cutting through the chop, idling 50 yards out. Their ride. But as Elias moved to signal the boat, a shadow detached itself from the nearest crane. Marcus Vance stepped into the open, his overcoat plastered to his body, a sleek, silver handgun leveled directly at Elias's head. The neon light from the distant city caught the rain dripping from the barrel. Vance was bleeding from a graze on his cheek. His perfect veneer finally cracked, revealing the rabid dog beneath. "You cost me a lot of money tonight, Elias," Vance snarled, his voice cutting through the fading sounds of the gunfight behind them. "But I'm still leaving with the drive." Elias stepped in front of Chloe, his own weapon raised, his boots planted firmly on the edge of the abyss. The rain hammered down, washing the blood from his hands. He had lost the millions, but as he stared down the barrel of Vance's gun, Elias Thorne finally found his soul. "You're not leaving with anything, Marcus," Elias said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Except a body bag." The rain did not merely fall. It drove hard against the cracked asphalt of Pier 44, a relentless, freezing sheet that turned the dockyard into a slick mirror of urban decay. Above them, a massive, flickering neon billboard, a sprawling advertisement for a life none of them would ever lead, bathed the standoff in rhythmic, suffocating waves of blood red and synthetic blue. The neon bled into the puddles, fracturing under the heavy combat boots of the men who surrounded Elias Thorne. This was the end of the line, the final stop on the Ransom route. Elias stood at the southern edge of the loading zone, his trench coat plastered to his skin, heavy with the weight of the water and the sheer exhaustion of the past 72 hours. In his right hand, gripped so tightly his knuckles glowed bone-white under the neon, was the prototype, the Archimedes drive. It was a sleek cylinder of gunmetal and tempered quartz, currently pulsing with a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated up Elias's forearm. It was the size of a thermos, yet it held enough proprietary quantum energy schematics to rewrite the global power grid. It was the reason the whistleblower had bled out on the floor of that subterranean lair 2 nights ago. It was the reason Elias had spent the last week living off burner phones and dodging black SUVs. And it was the reason Marcus Vance was currently pressing the barrel of a custom, silver-plated automatic against the temple of Chloe Davis. "You've run out of asphalt, Elias," Vance called out. His voice was a smooth, cultured purr that somehow cut effortlessly through the hiss of the torrential downpour. Vance stood 30 yards away, flanked by 4 heavily armed mercenaries wearing the matte black tactical gear of the Vanguard Corporation. Vance himself wore a bespoke suit that seemed entirely immune to the elements, an umbrella held over him by a silent, towering enforcer. Chloe kneeled on the wet pavement in front of Vance, her hands bound behind her back with thick zip ties. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, a jagged cut above her left eyebrow weeping a steady stream of crimson that washed away in the rain. But when she looked at Elias, her eyes were completely devoid of fear. They were alight with a fierce, burning defiance. She gave him a microscopic shake of her head. "Don't give it to him." To Elias's left, completing the deadly triangle of this crossroads of greed, stood the Apex Syndicate. They were Vance's rivals, the brutal street-level empire that had clawed its way into the corporate stratosphere. Their leader, a scarred lieutenant named Silas, stood beside a black armored transport. At Silas's feet rested a brushed steel briefcase, 50 million in untraceable bearer bonds and newly minted crypto drives. "The ransom. The transaction is simple, Thorn," Silas barked, his voice rough like grinding gears. "Toss the drive to us. You pick up the case. Vance lets the girl go, or my boys turn his designer suit into a colander. If he tosses that drive to you, Silas, your boys won't live long enough to pull their triggers." Vance countered smoothly, cocking the hammer of his silver pistol. The metallic click was sickeningly loud. "The drive goes to Vanguard. Elias takes the money. The girl lives. That was the arrangement we brokered at the crossroads." Elias looked between the two factions, the rain stinging his eyes. He felt the cold, hard weight of the burner phone dead in his pocket. He remembered the torn label on the shipping crate where this entire nightmare had begun. He looked at the rival armies, both trembling with trigger-happy adrenaline, both perfectly willing to slaughter him, and Chloe the absolute second the Archimedes drive left his hand. There was no honor among these thieves. The briefcase of cash was bait. The standoff was a powder keg, and the prototype was the match. If Vanguard got the drive, they would execute Elias and Chloe to tie up loose ends. If Apex got it, the result would be the exact same. The corporate giants and the syndicate lords operated on the exact same algorithm. Leave no witnesses. Elias looked at Chloe. She was shivering, the cold creeping into her bones, but she held his gaze. She had been dragged into this because she had tried to decrypt the whistleblower's files. She had risked everything for the truth. Elias wasn't going to let her die for a piece of corporate hardware. An icy, crystalline clarity washed over Elias, colder than the rain. He didn't need to win the game. He just needed to flip the board. "You both want it so badly?" Elias yelled, his voice rough, scraping against his throat. He raised the Archimedes drive. 50 million is a lot of money, Silas. But Vanguard's market share is worth billions. Isn't it, Vance? "Don't play games, Elias," Vance warned, the polite veneer slipping to reveal the venom beneath. He pressed the gun harder against Chloe's skin. "Put it on the ground." "I have a better idea," Elias said. His thumb found the recessed manual override dial on the base of the cylinder, the emergency purge the whistleblower had desperately tried to warn him about. The failsafe. Elias twisted the dial a full 180 degrees. A sharp, metallic snap echoed from the cylinder. Instantly, the gentle blue pulse of the quartz chamber snapped into a violent, blinding amber. The low hum escalated into a high-pitched, teeth-aching shriek. The air around Elias instantly tasted of heavy ozone and scorched copper. "What are you doing?" Vance screamed, stepping back, his umbrella dropping to the wet asphalt. "He's overloading the core," Silas roared, raising his assault rifle. "Shoot him." "Catch," Elias whispered, with every ounce of strength in his shoulder. Elias hurled the screeching, blindingly bright cylinder high into the air. It arced beautifully through the driving rain, a spinning comet of unstable quantum energy, perfectly positioned to land dead in the center of the 30 yards separating Vanguard and the Apex Syndicate. "Get down!" Elias screamed. He didn't wait to see it land. He lunged forward, diving across the jagged, puddle-strewn asphalt toward Chloe. The prototype hit the ground. For a fraction of a microsecond, the world went completely, utterly silent. The rain seemed to freeze in midair. Then the asphalt tore open. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was a detonation of pure kinetic and electromagnetic fury. A sphere of blinding, white-hot plasma expanded outward with a deafening, concussive crack that ruptured the night. The shockwave hit Elias like a physical wall of concrete, throwing him the last few feet. He crashed into Chloe, wrapping his body around hers, burying their faces into the flooded pavement as the world above them disintegrated. The massive neon billboard overhead overloaded, showering the docks with an explosive rain of shattered glass and sparking argon tubes. The shockwave flipped the black SUVs like discarded toys. The sound of rending metal, shattering glass, and superheated steam hissed into the atmosphere as the rain vaporized instantly against the blistering heat of the blast radius. Elias's ears rang with a high, sustained pitch, his vision swimming with purple afterimages. But as the blinding light faded into a choking cloud of gray smoke and steam, a new sound erupted. Gunfire. Deafened, disoriented, and completely blinded by the smoke, the surviving Vanguard mercenaries and the Apex enforcers did exactly what their instincts commanded. Believing the other side had initiated the attack, they opened fire. The wet night lit up with the jagged, strobing flashes of muzzle fire. The heavy thud-thud-thud of automatic weapons ripped through the steam. Bullets sparked against shipping containers and tore through the husks of ruined vehicles. Screams of fury and pain echoed through the dockyard as the two corporate titans tore into each other in a blind, bloody panic. "Chloe!" Elias coughed, tasting ash and blood in his mouth. He pushed himself up, grabbing her shoulders. "Chloe, are you hit?" She coughed violently, shaking her head, her eyes wide but focused.
"I'm okay."
"Elias, my hands." Elias drew the serrated combat knife from his boot and sliced cleanly through the thick plastic zip ties binding her wrists. She gasped, rubbing her raw skin, but immediately grabbed his arm to help him up. "We have to move!" Elias shouted over the deafening roar of the crossfire. Tracers zipped overhead, burning angry red lines through the smoke. "The prototype is dust," Elias said, pulling her low to the ground. "Come on." They scrambled on their hands and knees, keeping beneath the trajectory of the flying lead. The asphalt was slick with water, oil, and fresh blood. Elias navigated through the blinding fog of steam and smoke, his internal compass guiding him toward the eastern flank where Silas had stood. Suddenly, his knee slammed into something hard and metallic. Elias looked down. Through the swirling gray mist, illuminated by the erratic flashing of the dying neon sign above, sat the brushed steel briefcase. It had been blown clear of the Apex transport, miraculously intact, its heavy latches still sealed tight. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the thick, rubberized handle of the case. It was heavy. $50 million of pure, concentrated freedom. "Got it!" Elias yelled. He reached out with his free hand and found Chloe's fingers. He gripped her hand tight, pulling her up. Together, they broke into a sprint, abandoning the kill zone. They ran through the labyrinth of towering, rust-streaked shipping containers, their boots splashing heavily in the deep puddles. Behind them, the symphony of destruction raged on. The Vanguard and Apex syndicates were locked in a death spiral, expending their ammunition, their men, and their empires over a crater of scorched earth and a prize that no longer existed. Elias and Chloe didn't stop running until the sharp crack of gunfire faded into dull pops, drowned out by the rising wail of police sirens approaching from the city grid. They finally slowed to a halt beneath the awning of an abandoned warehouse, miles from Pier 44. The rain here fell in a gentle, rhythmic patter against the corrugated tin roof. The harsh neon of the city skyline painted the wet streets in soft, watercolor hues of gold and violet. Chloe leaned against the brick wall, chest heaving, her wet hair plastered to her neck. She looked at Elias, then down at the heavy steel briefcase in his hand. A slow, incredulous laugh escaped her lips, breathless and exhausted. Elias leaned back against the wall beside her. His body ached, his clothes were ruined, and he was bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts. But as he looked at Chloe, alive and breathing, and felt the weight of their new future anchored in his hand, a tired smile broke across his face. The prototype was gone. The giants were bleeding each other dry on the wet asphalt. And for the first time since the torn label had dragged him into the underworld, Elias Thorne was finally off the grid. He offered Chloe his hand. She took it, her grip warm and strong. Without looking back, they stepped out from the shadows and disappeared into the neon-lit rain.